Good morning, everyone. My name is Marina Affo, and I'm a reporter here at Delaware Online and the News Journal. Thank you for joining us today for this important community conversation. Last summer, as the world grappled with race relations and statues of Confederate figures and historical monuments were coming down across the country, Wilmington was going through similar events. Statues of Christopher Columbus and Caesar Rodney came down in early June after national and local protests. Delaware Online has now gathered a panel of experts and community members to talk about these statues and monuments, what happens now, how we should be moving forward as a city and as a state. But we are just looking forward to this community conversation. So now I will introduce our panelists. First, we have Mike Brickner, who is Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Delaware, a nonprofit civil liberties organization. We have Charisma McGee, a field organizer and activist who led some of the George Floyd protests in Wilmington in 2020. Ernest Trippi Congo is president of the Wilmington City Council, and he will be joining us shortly. We have John Tedman, who is executive director of the Caesar Rodney Institute, a nonprofit research organization. And we have Dr. Theodore Davis Jr., a University of Delaware professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. We encourage audience participation, so comment below any thoughts and questions you have. And as the conversation flows, we will ask the panelists some of your questions. So everyone has been given ground rules, so let's get into it. First question for you guys, as a historian, field organizer, politician, heads of nonprofit organizations, what were your initial reactions to the statues being taken down last year? I will start off with you, Charisma.
I would say my reaction was not only it's about time, but thinking about how those statues were taken down, but then in Smyrna it was a whipping post that was taken down outside of the Delaware courthouse in July. So it had to been a month since those statues were taken down that post still stood. And then I even just thinking about the rhetoric and being around Ledge Hall and that being outside of a courthouse, what that means and the rhetoric that means and how the imagery that portrays, I think that my reaction was, it's about time, but it's reflective of where Delaware has been.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. John?
Just to clarify, Caesar Rodney Institute is about 15 years old. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and we analyze policies. That's what we do. So the reaction to it, I think, was a mix of puzzlement. Why are we doing this? I will take the mayor at his word that he was protecting the statue from it, and also with the Christopher Columbus taking that statue down. I think in the heat of all the protests, which are legitimate protests, no problem with us on that. With the heat of the protests, maybe that was the right thing to do at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Mike?
Well, so I was excited that I think it's the first step in really analyzing our history here in Delaware and in the United States. We have all sorts of historical figures in our history as a state and as a country that have very complex backgrounds, right? Where they have done many good things, but also many horrible things. And oftentimes with these types of statues, it really only tells one perspective or one side of the story and doesn't give the full context. And so, removing the statues, I think that gives us as a community an opportunity to start to talk about how do we want to present history out to the public? How do we want to talk about these oftentimes complicated figures? And how does that impact us today and in the future about how we want to talk about racial justice, how we want to address the issues that have had a longstanding and very, very significant impact on our communities.
And Dr. Davis? You're muted.
Okay, I think we're good now. Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. I had kind of mixed emotions on a number of different fronts. One, as a person of African heritage. Second, as kind of I don't want to say a scholar because I don't consider myself to be a scholar. But I was very concerned about what I would consider to be the rush to judgment, that things were kind of moving very fast without, I won't say much thought, but without adequate thought and considerations in terms of why we're doing what we're doing. I did not object per se, but I wanted to, I thought we needed to give more reason and more understanding. As a person of color, I take the position that history is history, and I'm very concerned about movements to, I won't say it was not even about revising history, but in some instances it's about erasing history. Slavery is what it is. Well, it was what it was. It existed at the time. And I just think that particularly as Blacks, it gives us an opportunity to think about really in terms of how do we put our stamp on telling the story about slavery, as opposed to always responding to other people's stamp. And so I'll leave it there and then kind of advance forward. We'll talk about this maybe more in the conversation.
Yeah. I would love to hear from anyone. And at this point, everyone can just popcorn in about sort of what you're thinking about other people's responses at this point. And while you're thinking about that as well, what the statues, meant to you and your organization and how that relates to just your feelings on it, and what the statues really meant for you. John?
Yeah, just to clarify a couple of things. The American Revolution had heroes. We all know the heroes, and they're well publicized in Washington and Jefferson and so on and so forth. The revolution also had several unsung heroes. Among the unsung heroes was, without any question in our view, and I believe the historical record, Caesar Rodney was one of the most impactful folks that actually you wouldn't even have the Declaration of Independence without him, in the ride and all the history, so on and so forth. I certainly agree with and that's why our institute was named after him. It took tremendous courage for all of these people to do what they did. If you remember Ben Franklin's comment to when they're in the Constitutional Convention trying to figure out what to do and what are we going to do here? What are we going to do? We got to do something, because if we don't hang together, we're all going to hang separately. And if you understand the period at the time, I mean, the two biggest giant machineries of war at that time were England and France. We're a colony of England. We're gonna say, no, we're not going to be a colony anymore. We're going to secede from you. We're going to fight you. We're going to get rid of you. That's a hugely dangerous thing to do. And so one of the reasons we're named for him, for his courage, liberty, individual liberty, and that's to me the nexus of Caesar Rodney Institute, and why Delaware should really be, as Obama came a couple of years ago and had a presentation on his behalf, and recently Trump did as well. So you've got yourself in this state a hero, and it shouldn't be obliterated, is our opinion.
As a way of follow up, at that time I thought that there were two, in terms of racial justice, there were kind of two underlying issues there. And one issue had to do with, okay, so for removal, the two issues for removal of statues, one had to do primarily, particularly in terms of Caesar Rodney, it wasn't about the historical significance to Delaware and to the nation's independence, but it centered around the issue of ownership of slavery. The other issue that was out there centered around the Confederacy. And I think somehow the two got merged together. I mean, the Confederacy, there was an issue of treason there, right? There was, even when you talk about the issue of the preservation of a culture, a way of life, even that, can be separated within that domain about the Confederacy. So to me, I did not tie Caesar Rodney to this whole issue of the Confederacy. The whole issue came to the ownership of slaves. And so because that was the main thing, the main driver, that seemed to be the issue that was driving the removal, then I think we do need to look at the person and kind of, the question to me was, if we're just going to look at that part of the individual and not look at the individual in his or her totality, are we doing that? Are we doing justice to ourselves in terms of from a historical, from a cultural, etc.?
I really appreciate that, and I think that speaks to the complexity of a lot of historical figures. As John just said, Caesar Rodney did have many great contributions to society, and then he also owned slaves, and that he also had a lot of complicated parts of his history. I was thinking back to my childhood, and when I was a kid, my dad is a huge history buff, and we went to the DC area every year to do tours. And one of the places we went to multiple times was Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. And I went back about 2 years ago, and recently they've added more historical context. They've recreated the slave quarters. They've actually added pictures and historical context of what slavery was like for people who lived at Monticello. And they've really enriched the telling of the history. And I think that's where, I would like the conversation to go is, we're not necessarily saying, well, let's not talk about the positive, but if we're only putting the historical contributions, the positive historical contributions, then we're also erasing this other part of the history that we're not talking about. And so it's important for us, I think, as a society and as a community to tell that full story.
So we have with us Trippy Congo now. So Trippy, we are discussing sort of the initial reactions to the statues coming down, but also the impact of the statues to you and your organization. So that's sort of where the conversation was going. Okay. To get you up to speed. Charisma, did you want to add anything?
Oh, yes. Mike, I would, and everyone, I would agree on the historical significance of the statues and monuments, towards how monuments relay significance and tell a full story. But I do believe that those monuments being up and owning slaves, it brings subtle traumas that Americans have to live and see when they do see these statues and these monuments. And I think it frames and asks the question, what do we value, and what do we value in our communities going forward? And I think understanding and being mindful of history and significance. And I don't believe that it's erasing history to take down a statue and maybe, like Mike said, create something that really shows something in its full picture and significance.
Yeah, Charisma, you bring up a good point that sort of leads me into my next question of, so you had the statues go down. Some people had some visceral reactions to it. And obviously, we have seen the photos from last year of people putting graffiti in where they once stood, and across the country, Columbus statues in Boston were beheaded and things like that. So people had a very visceral reaction to those statues. So what would you like to see happen now? John, would you like to see the statues go back up in the exact same places with nothing added? Or would you like to see something else added, or no to the statues in totality? So I'd love to hear from you guys what you're thinking in all of your various positions and all of your various knowledge.
Well, frankly, Marina, we have sort of taken the position of waiting until things cool down a little bit before having the conversation on what the next steps were. With respect to Ted's observation, which is factual, that last year's protests, this one included, were all about slavery, and that's a fact. It was all about anybody that owned slaves at the time. But on the record, with this particular individual, Caesar Rodney, first governor of the state, I think they call him a president right for the first very bit, became the first governor of the state of Delaware. In 1803, he presented legislation to the state legislature to abolish slavery. And you see Ted nodding. Correct. Right. Guess what? The state legislature voted it down, said, no, we're going to keep it. So, I mean, you don't want to, castigate if you're going to give Caesar Rodney a hard time. What you really ought to do is to give the whole legislature a hard time.
Yeah,
I don't know exactly what they should do. You have Caesar Rodney Square. Our position is he's really one of the most impactful people Delaware ever produced. And I don't really have an answer there. That'd be a discussion, what to do.
I was actually going to bring that point up to Mike and Charisma in terms of, does that change the focus of understanding that, was he, and I'm not trying to defend, my purpose here is to get information to make a reasonable and a valid judgment about how we proceed. But was he, quote, a man of his time in terms of, look, this is the way in which, from an economic standpoint, this is the way in which is available to me this is how I run my plantation, and therefore I'm going to take advantage of it. But at the same time, by him introducing this legislation, and I didn't know he was governor. I thought he was the speaker of what was the House, but the way in which the government was structured, the Speaker of the House basically was the president of the governor and president of the state. But I don't want to give the impression, because this issue of slavery itself was and is bad. But slavery is an institution that goes, slavery did not only exist in the Western Hemisphere. Now, it was a different type of slavery, but there was slavery in Europe. There was slavery in Africa. There was slavery in Asia. So it was, and in terms of ownership of slaves, I just think that and someone talked about this earlier, from an educational point of view, I hope we take this opportunity to educate ourselves and to begin to really rethink, particularly as African Americans, right? We have a tendency to be a little more reactive about slavery than to be proactive about it. There's nothing for Black people to be ashamed of. As slaves, our people coming out of slaves, we took basically a little of nothing and we made something out of it. Yet today, we have a lot and we're making a little out of it. So, I mean, we need to kind of not look at slavery as something that was just, yes, I'm sorry we went through it, but you can't unring that bell. And all I'm just saying is, in terms of slavery, putting things in perspective. Let's not just rush into it. Let's use this as a moment not only to educate others, but as a moment to educate ourselves. And if we come to the conclusion that, we're going to remove Caesar Rodney for slavery, then, we also need, and this is my last point now, we need to be careful because other generations might come forth and say, well, Martin Luther King was rather homophobic in terms of, and Malcolm X certainly talked about white people as being blue-eyed devils. So do we, future generations decide that we're just going to remove them because, and is that fair? And do we not take into consideration all of the things that they have done? I just think that if we're going to do it, let's not rush into it.
Trippy, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yes, thank you. I do apologize for being late, just getting off for work. But I think moving forward, I think we have to acknowledge that, I think someone mentioned, I think John mentioned, we have to wait till things cool down. I'm not sure if things will ever cool down. There's always going to be a lot of sensitivity around Caesar Rodney, the statue, and slavery. And I know that there were several types of slavery, but I'm not sure if the other types of slavery had the kind of ramifications that the slavery here did. So I think that we have to take that into consideration also. Like we're still seeing and living, what slavery did to us, to our ancestors. Like we're still living that. Like we're still, we're still segregated. We're still not playing on an even field. So I don't think that we can try to minimize American slavery by comparing it to slavery that happened in other countries. I think I think it will always be a very sensitive topic if we talk about bringing the statues back, because we're living in a different climate. We're living in a climate where people have immediate access to information, and we really want to see some type of systemic change. And I think bringing those statues back will set us back as well.
Sort of staying in line with that point, and I think Charisma actually brought it up earlier about looking at these statues. So last summer when one of them came down, I was speaking to a woman who lived in a nursing home where the Christopher Columbus statue was. And she was ecstatic that it came down because she said she would walk by it every single day and it would be a traumatic experience for her. So I'd love to hear from you guys about sort of how do we grapple with who we celebrate, how we celebrate them, and this idea of traumas that are still affecting people years and years past slavery, past the civil rights movement and things like that as well. So I'd love to hear from you guys a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think we have to, if I can go first, I think we have to, again, acknowledge that Wilmington is a city that is made up of 70% Black and brown. So we can't make light of that. And we have to respect, understand that we all need information to make the best decisions. But I think that coming from born and raised in a city that is 70% Black and brown, we have to make sure that we are listening to what our residents are saying. So, and not taking anything away from whatever the other panelists feel. But I think we can't ignore the fact that Wilmington is Black and brown. So we have to keep that at the forefront.
Mike, did you want to add anything?
I really appreciated what Charisma said earlier about the trauma, and that, seeing these figures out in the public space and being lauded does have an impact on particularly people of color. And I think that, to speak about the history, slavery is a complicated matter in that it did not necessarily end in 1865 with the Civil War, right? We don't talk about what happened in Reconstruction and the Jim Crow laws. Oftentimes that part of our American history is sort of glossed over. The after effects of slavery did not end with the passage of all of the civil rights legislation in 1965. And the after effects of slavery are still not gone today in 2021, that we are still grappling with those remnants. And, there's the daily trauma, I think, of seeing different symbols that might elevate folks who are connected to slavery or connected to white supremacy. There's also the daily trauma of the parts of history not being talked about, right? There's the trauma of silence too. And I think that that's why, as we're talking about having a more full conversation around history, we need to do that. We need to talk about the things that are sometimes painful and sometimes hard for us to talk about. And that needs to then also lead to actual policy change, right? I'm glad that we're having dialogue and conversation, but we also have to change the structures that keep white supremacy in power in this country and have perpetuated historical oppression upon people of color in this country.
Can I just to Mr. Congo, I don't want, and I hope I did not give you the impression that somehow I was minimizing and comparing slavery because I thought I said that slavery in the Western Hemisphere was perhaps the most brutal and a very different type of slavery that existed in other parts. I don't want to leave it out there that somehow I am minimizing. But, Marina, you asked very early on, what came through my mind when the monument was taken down? And I find this to be very problematic. We're sitting here and everybody's talking about the monument against slavery, but nobody's talking about building, because what came to my mind was, well, you know what? We need to be established and building some type of a commemorative monument or some type of a space in Delaware where we recognize slavery. I mean, to me, again, it's something that happened, and it's time for people of color, for Black people, to stop always being reactive and begin being proactive. How do there are a lot of positive things about our people as we survive this particular institution that we could learn from, that would help us to deal with a lot of the problems that we are living with as a people today. Yes, there's a connection. Yes, this thing is moving forward. But why not take and say, okay, I thought about, okay, if slavery was that big of a problem with the Caesar Rodney monument, why don't somebody think about, well, why don't we take part of that space around that monument and use it to inform people about slavery in Delaware, right? How do we, is this something that we want to consider? I mean, I just take I don't want to erase the memories of slavery. We don't hear other people talking about erasing the memories of the atrocities that happened to them. It happened. We need to use this as something to feed upon, to inspire us, to motivate us, to look at what happened to our people and how we survived and how we overcame. And these are the things that are out there that we can use for positive, as opposed to always just, okay, this is somebody who treated me wrong, taking that position.
Yeah, John, you had your hand up, and then I'm going to go back to Charisma right after.
I actually am excited and happy to endorse what Ted is suggesting. Let the Black community take a leadership role in addressing these issues of sensitivity, these issues of historical context. Charles Barkley famously said not too long ago, he said, if you have a problem and you're in emotional distress every time you drive past a particular statue, he says, you're going to have a problem in dealing with life. All right. It is history. It is fact. It is what happened. let's show some leadership on addressing a way to bring forward the recognition of the problems of slavery and the continuing stain that has. The slavery is all over the world. I mean, you got 1 million Uyghurs that are fundamentally enslaved, right? You had Darfur enslaved. This has been going on for centuries. It's nothing new, but it's nothing good about it, all right, at all. We completely endorse that. One person brought up to me the other day, said, we wouldn't be having this conversation we're having right now if it weren't for that statue of Caesar Rodney. So I think the biggest risk here that Ted's recommendation can solve is that right now you're at the risk of erasing history, which is the absolute worst thing you can do. If you erase your history as a nation, as a state, as a community, you are absolutely putting yourself at the risk of the new people are going to write whatever the new history is according to them. This history is factual. It's there. You have to deal with it. And let's deal with it going forward rather than erasing it, which is a very, very dangerous thing to do.
Charisma?
And I would say that it's not a sense of someone walking past the statue and feeling a disturbance in their person. It is the same in Wilmington. Just to use Wilmington for example, a student in Wilmington, Black student would walk past that statue in Wilmington, and then they would go to their school where most likely there's an SRO, a police officer, and where almost every school in Delaware has the SRO, a police officer, and still feel the oversight and trauma that they would in walking past the statue. And in the same school, they would learn about the history and the significance of Caesar Rodney, and which I do believe that there is. I believe that there is significance to understanding history. However, and even when it was brought up that he was a man of his time, I think that we have to set the standard for. We have to set the standard for what do we hold, and what do we value. So the question was brought up if we want to take someone down because they are homophobic in a certain time. I do personally believe that if that is the standard that we hold in our community, that statues put people on pedestals. They are a pedestal, and people look to that and they look towards, oh, this is who I want to be and this is who I want to be like. And I do agree with the fact that a center for slavery and trauma could be implemented and brought back, but I don't take away the hurt and the pain that people would feel. I think it is valued.
Sort of staying with that, Charisma, I will ask you a follow-up question of, now that we've sort of heard everyone's thoughts and everything on this, I'd love to hear from you guys sort of what you want to see happen with the statues, and not just with the statues, but institutions named like the Caesar Rodney Institute or Caesar Rodney School District, and things like that, right? What happens to those things, right? And across the country, there have been multiple different reactions. So there have been Columbus statues taken down, Caesar Rodney statues taken down, Confederate flags taken down, the whipping post. So there is a lot of stuff around this issue and monuments and things like that. So I'd love to hear sort of what you guys would like to see in terms of us moving forward. And just to give some examples to the people watching at home, in places like Philly, the Columbus statue is still up, but it has a blockade around it, and local residents have sued to keep the statue up. So the city's public art director is working with that group and anyone interested to find a new home for the statue. In Boston, a Columbus statue was beheaded, and it will be repaired and then relocated to another part of the city. And then the area that the statue actually was originally will have another monument honoring Italian immigrants. And then in Chicago, the statues are still in storage, and a committee has been formed to review sort of all of the city's monuments, and temporary art pieces are being commissioned that will focus on a number of topics like COVID-19, inequality, and racial reconciliation. And then last example for y'all, in Florida, Robert E. Lee, there was a bust of him that was taken down in June. And in September, the city of Fort Myer voted to keep the bust down permanently. And it's going to be taken down permanently and never put back up. So I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you feel like in your positions the right step is, or something to consider?
I'll go if that's okay.
Yes, that's okay.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure if there is any place in Wilmington that those statues could be replaced where it wouldn't cause some type of mental trauma. And at a minimum, it might cause worse. So I think that we really have to be careful around this topic. I've been saying this since they came down, that we really have to be careful about even having a conversation around replacing those statues, just because of the effect that it has on so many people who live here and would have access to it. So in my opinion, I don't think that we can move forward. Like, do the benefits of replacing that statue outweigh the repercussions that it could cause? I think that we all have to, we appreciate history, but we all have to be honest with ourselves. And if we place those, were to replace those statues, will it outweigh the results, the possible results of not only mental trauma, but physical damage? And is that what we want? Is that what we want our next generation to experience? I don't think that those statues can come back, unfortunately, or fortunately. I think it's a good thing that they came down because of the effect that it has on so many people who live here and are raised here and have to see that and know. We're privileged to a lot more information, so they can go and they can Google the complete history of those men and find out what they weren't taught in school. So if we're really serious about Black people controlling the message, I don't think that can be done through statues or monuments. If we have access to our public education system, that's when we can really make the kind of we can really have the kind of effect that we're talking about through a statue. I don't think a statue can help educate the way our public schools can, and our public school systems have always hid the complete truth. So if we're really going to have that conversation around controlling the message, it has to come through our public school system. Thank you.
Mike, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think Trippy makes some really great points, and I think that this is now an opportunity for us to not just focus on like what was the historical marker or the statue that was there before, but really what story do we want to tell in our community? What do we want to say about our past history? And we had the Caesar Rodney statue or the Columbus statue up. But now is an opportunity for us to say, what's the story that we actually want to tell, and making sure that all voices are in the room to make sure that story is inclusive and actually tells the full context behind history. I don't think that the answer is in erasing history. It doesn't sound like I think anybody here agrees with, just not speaking about certain parts of history, but it's about talking more about it. And I absolutely agree that Black and brown people can and should be leading a lot of those discussions and everything. I also want to be clear, though, that does not absolve we white folks from doing our own work, right? That we oftentimes, unfortunately, put a lot of the emotional and mental labor on people of color to try and kind of solve race issues, and that we have to do our own work on these issues and have some of those tough discussions amongst white people to help to get our history in order. And as Trippy said, a lot of that may happen at the school board level, in the classroom level, at the kitchen or dining room table level, right? Where we're having conversations with our friends and our family about what the real history of America is, and being clear about, there are folks who did really wonderful things, but they also have these other complicated pieces of their history, and we've got to be aware of all of that.
Yes, Professor.
Yeah, so what you decide, what Wilmington, Delaware decides to do with the statues, I can live with it. Here's my position. There needs to be in place a process that to just all of a sudden a few people pull up and say, yeah, we don't like this, we need to take it down, and we take it down because of that. We need to have in place some type of process. So some of the things we need to consider as part of this process. We really need to look into who this person was that this honor was bestowed, right? Why was this person honored? What were they honored for? I agree with Charisma in terms of we do need to take into consideration, was this person's behavior inconsistent with the values of today? But we also cannot forget what happened at the time that these decisions were made. I do think that each succeeding generation has the right to honor their heroes. So I can see at some point someone saying, hey, let's change the name from Rodney Square, Caesar Rodney Square, to Joe Biden Square, because now he's the president of the United States. That will happen. All I'm saying is, as we go down this road, let's give some thought to it. Let's put a process in place wherein if we decide at the end of the day that Caesar Rodney's statue deserves to be removed for whatever the reason is tied to contemporary values. Now, let's not, we cannot erase the value judgment of past generations, because remember, in 100 years from now, our heroes, again, someone might be thinking about removing them for a reason that we would not even consider today. So I'm just saying, if we're going to do this, let's be guided. Two things. Let's be guided by a process. And two, as a community of Black people, we have got to get out front in terms of defining who we are and writing our history and presenting our history to the community, and not necessarily every time somebody else come up and say, oh, this was bad. We want to, even if it's not erased, we want to modify history so that it's going to make us feel good. Sometimes it's about the uncomfortable moment. This is my last comment and I'll stop. But in terms of the removal of the whipping post, I go, man, this was a historical monument that, in terms of people walking past it and people getting somehow feeling bad about it, that should have been a motivator to say, damn, this is what my people went through, and my people use this to do I'm going to work that much harder. If we keep continuing to tell people that this is going to make them feel bad, they're going to make them feel bad. How do we take and use this as a motivator for the young people who walk through, who go through that square to say, you know what? Because of him, if we want to frame it that way, bad things happen to my people, and I'm going to work hard and overcome this. That's just how, we just need to kind of rethink how we think things in our community.
John?
Professor Davis and I are really on the same page. I listened to City Council President Beppo, and they said, well, it's at the moment, just today's environment, it's too high a lift to put the statue back. It would do more damage than not. I hear you. Don't erase history. Maybe the statue belongs in Dover. This individual was a legitimate, important person in this nation, came from Delaware, and he's a legitimate Delaware impactful hero. You can't just throw him out and just crush it up and make, pennies out of the copper. That's not the way to deal with this. Are we going to be upset? Are whites upset every single time that they turn on Malcolm X Boulevard after all the things Malcolm X said? We're not doing that. So Yeah, I think you got to get some clarity on this. I understand Mike's point about whites' responsibility and so forth. And with lots of good intentions over the years, white politicians have made life actually more difficult for the black community, particularly in welfare legislation over the last 50 years. It's had a negative, impactful on the family structure in the blacks. So, okay, stop trying to, for whites trying to, solve the blacks' problems that way or legitimate for whatever reasons, right? People both look forward. Look, here's the problem. Let's solve the problem. Stop pointing blame. Stop saying, I don't feel good about it or I don't feel bad about it. Let's have a process, a conversation, as the professor says, on how to move forward instead of wallowing in this kind of whole issue of I don't feel good about it or I feel good about it or I feel guilty about it or I have to do something about it. So I'm not giving a solution. I'm suggesting, along with the professor, that we work to get a solution.
Charisma?
I would say that I just, in no world I would see a whipping post as a motivator. I wouldn't see it as and I don't think that it's within the young people and the generation coming behind to have the responsibility on them to be proactive and create their own corner, create their own Black space corner that they can feel comfortable. They should be able to look in their community and their society and say, these people are reflective of the values that I hold dear in my community. And I don't think that feeling averse to the trauma that you feel is an erasure of history. And while I do believe that history, maybe on a statue, it could say, like in Kentucky, there was a statue of Breonna Taylor that was, before it was defaced, it was put up, and people who are in their communities, they said, no, this is who I want to see represented in my community, who I want to see in a statue. And they put up that statue before it was defaced. And it was, I think it was a question of responsibility. Who is responsible for making these monuments, putting these statues together, and who do we look up to? Who is in our community, like who can we look towards and who can we value? And then at the same time, just I don't think it's a question of proactivity versus being reactionary. I think it's a real question of creating spaces that we want to see and making that change. I would personally like to see a diverse celebration of history, maybe even modern people that we hold dear, and maybe even on the statues, they could say Caesar Rodney was here, his history, here's his legacy, and now in the same square, if we change from Caesar Rodney Square to Joe Biden Square, maybe an excerpt or something saying, this in this place, this used to be this, and now times are changing towards this, maybe recognizing, but I don't think the responsibility should be on young people to hold that in and then and maybe create their own corner or space where I think that everyone, the monuments and historic monuments should serve the communities, and they should, paid for by taxpayer dollars, they should serve the communities and values that are reflective of the people that live there.
Well, everyone, we are coming up on time, but as you can tell, this conversation is just beginning, and a variety of opinions, but this conversation is just beginning. I want to thank each of our panelists for being here with us today, sharing all of your viewpoints, and just being very open with us about having a frank discussion about this. For everyone viewing, this is clearly a hot button issue, so we are going to continue to look at it here at Delaware Online. So you should definitely continue to follow and come back to us for future coverage of this. And we just really appreciate everyone for your comments and being a part of this discussion.
All right.